Hello. Oh, it's very crowded in here. That's great. You know, if this were the 18th century, and it gets too crowded during the 18th century, there's a way to make it less crowded. And I mention the 18th century because we'll be discussing Mozart. We would simply ask the men to remove their swords and leave them outside. That happened at the premiere of Handel's Messiah. The men left their swords outside, and the women left their hoops from their hoop skirts in the hallway and made a lot more room. But you have to imagine what that means, that the audience came in and all the men had a weapon. I mean, we're there again. I gave a concert in Georgia where I was told by somebody presenting the concert that a lot of people in the audience had guns. But it doesn't do the same thing to leave them out in the hallway. But it's important to remember that Adorno, by the way, this relates to the piece you're about to hear. I'm not just free associating. But Adorno, the philosopher, whom I don't usually agree with, but I'm going to quote, said, "Every work of art is an uncommitted crime." And that might relate to this piece. The pen is mightier than the sword. It's another one of those things. Well, do you ever think of Mozart with a sword? Probably not. Did he have one? Yes. And what do we know about Mozart with a sword? Two things. When he was little, he was given swords by queens and nobility, but that was nothing. Those were presents. But there's a letter that I'm going to refer to before we hear some of the minuet from this piece. There's a letter Mozart wrote to Leopold, his father, in which he describes an incident called the Tyrolean incident. And he says in this letter that everyone's talking about something that happened recently. And since I, Mozart, have nothing else to say, I'm going to tell you what happened. A man named Wibner was walking down the street, and he was harassed by a man named Baron Buffa, which is incredible that his name was Buffa, but you know. And Baron Buffa was calling this guy names because Wibner had produced a theater piece that Baron Buffa thought was bad. So he was following down the street, telling him it was terrible, you shouldn't produce these sorts of things, and then calling him nasty names. And when Wibner turned around, Baron Buffa slugged this guy in the ear. So this guy, Wibner, hit him back, and then he went back home. And when he got home, he was arrested and brought to a quick trial at which he was given 50 lashes because Baron Buffa was a baron, and you do not strike a baron, even if you were first struck by said baron. Anyway, the 50 lashes was very serious, and he fainted at the end of it, and it took him 3 weeks to be able to stand up. And Mozart writes in this letter that Baron Buffa should get the same treatment. And he said, and if he doesn't get that treatment, I would run my sword through his heart. Mozart. Now, do we ever hear the sword in the music? Let's listen to this minuet from the beginning. No repeat is necessary. Okay, thank you. Now, I'm stopping them because I'm just trying to make a point. But as funny as that is, that's a minuet. Does it sound like a minuet? Not really. I mean, the same music, if it were in major, it's like this. That's sort of the politesse of a minuet. Now, I rewrote this, what you just heard, to take out these sword thrusts, leaving the music in minor. I took out the sword thrusts and the silences, just so you could hear a slightly more normal version of the exact same music. Let's try that. You see that it was, did you miss it? Only because you knew about it. Play that one more time, and what I'm going to explain to you is that it's not just the violent disruption that Mozart put in there that's fantastic, but the rest, the silence. And we'll hear that again after this version. Here's the fake version. Now, a minuet is a normally fairly polite dance of the nobility. And there's a famous minuet at the beginning of The Marriage of Figaro in which the story that is happening is the Count has been having a relationship with Figaro's wife, Susanna. And so Figaro sings, Se vuol ballare, signor Contino, you know that thing? If you want to dance, come to my dancing school. That's what he's saying. You know, if you want to learn to sing, I'll teach you to sing. I'll call the tune. It's the same thing, but the words do it. Here, the music does it. Now, am I saying that Mozart actually knew he was writing sword stabs here? No. I'm saying that it's like sword stabs. When he wrote this, though, his father, Leopold, was very ill and actually died afterward. So maybe these are moments of shock or grief or anger. Who knows? We'll never know what they actually are, and Mozart probably never articulated it to himself certainly not in English, but probably not in German either. But what you have, though, is a disruption of the minuet fabric that is violent. Let's hear the real thing again, and this time I won't stop you. Now, the first time you hear 2 stabbing chords, the second time 3. Now, one of the other things that we think of when we think of classical music is symmetry and balance. It's not always there. If it were always there, if everything were symmetrical, it would be totally predictable and boring. So it's often not there. But here, when Mozart does 3 chords, it has 2 purposes. One is obvious. It's a shock, because we heard the 2 chords the first time, and then we get one more. So it's surprising and exciting. But the other thing is, and this I'm sure was on Mozart's mind at some level, the first chord, the second chord, and the third chord. How many diminished 7th chords are there? 3. This is such a great group. Some of these people have been taking my class for 20 years, and they know that. Okay. There are 3 diminished 7th chords because, I'll say this as if you didn't know anything about it. The diminished 7th chord is the scary chord of music. It's symmetrical. Talk about symmetry. The chord itself is symmetrical because all the intervals are the same within it. So if you keep inverting it, turning it around, you can't tell that you've turned it around, as opposed to, let's say, a major chord. You can tell I moved it, but here, you can't. So if there are 4 notes, after 3 transpositions, you're done. That's 12 notes, that's all we've got. So Mozart did 2 things. He set up a dramatic situation with 2 stabbing chords, both diminished chords, so they're scary, and then did 3, and the 3 makes it even scarier, and it completes a saturated thing, which for a composer's ear is fabulous, even at that time. You know, it's complete. And that process of, or that idea of using the 3 diminished 7th chords in close proximity gets bigger and bigger in music. With Beethoven and with Schubert, it becomes enormous. He actually verges on something that becomes 20th century in concept, which we won't get into right now. Now, but there's something even more fundamental here. This is a very obvious example and a good example of Mozart ripping at the fabric of a minuet, tearing at the structure, disrupting it. There's a detour away from what is normal. And yes, it could be a sword thrust. Yes, it could be his father. It could be fear of death. It could be anger, whatever it is. But most important is the fact that that's what classical music at that time, that's what Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, that's what they did. They created forms by subverting the forms. It's an ironic sense. In other words, if you follow so-called rules of writing a minuet, you will have a very boring minuet. And there are no such minuets by Haydn, Mozart, or Beethoven. There are thousands of simple minuets by other composers, but they always have some kind of change, a change of key, a sudden new note, an unexpected modulation, a sudden sforzando, something in the rhythm. Something is a detour, a disruption, an interruption. And that's what classical music at that time, that's how the structures are made. In fact, let's go to the first movement and listen to a little bit of music and then start to talk about it. But my theme, so to speak, with this piece, and to a certain extent next week also with another piece of Mozart, is that the way the forms progress is by surprise, disruption, diversion, subversion of a norm. But we don't necessarily get the norm, but we can tell when it's subverted. So for example, when I took out those slashing chords, what you got was much more normal and much less interesting. It was still lovely. And you could keep reducing it by taking out detours and diversions. Let's hear the version, yes, of the opening of the first movement. Now, if you really know this piece, you're a little upset, because what I did was take out lots and lots and lots of music there. I made it ordinary. It's still lovely, because everything you heard was written by Mozart, with the exception of that final cadence, which, I mean, he did write that, but not there. So what I did here was normalize the music. And let's put back some of it right now. Let's hear it with, you know what. Right? Yes? Everybody know what we're going to hear it now with the... Okay. Okay, thank you. Now, that had a whole section you didn't hear before. But if you have a score and you know the piece, I only put back a little bit. There's much more. But let me explain to you what just happened. Let's take a look at the actual theme for a moment. We have this tiny motif, and the rhythm is what's important. And it starts just as a chord. Then we have the same rhythm, which is chromatic. You know, it's a little bit more angst-ridden, a little suggestive of more emotion because of the chromaticism. And then we come to a cadence and starts now an inversion of the opening, going down instead of up. Keep the rhythm going with a little ornament, a high point, but that's half the theme because it ends, it's only halfway there. So then it answers with the same idea, only in the viola, same music, but then everything changes. We get an interruption, which is a little bit disturbing because we could have gone to a cadence like I did the first time in order to remind you, because this is tricky. But I think if we get this clear, I think it'll be nice. So let's do the opening in the fake version again, and I will try to explain, I'll talk over you a little bit, what's been cut, or where it's been cut. So don't mind that I speak over you. Now the viola, answer. But now the interruption is gone and we get a cadence. Great, see, that's it. It's really short. That makes it a tune. Even though Mozart was a great melody writer, he never started a sonata, a symphony, a big piece of chamber music with a tune. You start with an unfinished tune. Half a tune, 3/4 of a tune. It's always interrupted. Great idea for a book on Mozart, Tune Interrupted. So let's put more of it back, because frankly, when we got this thing, when we got that, we only got 1, 2, 3, 4 measures back. Actually, there are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 measures I took out. That's a lot of music. Let's hear the real thing now. Another one. Another one. Oh, it's over now. Oh, it's not. Well, I guess it's changing key. Oh, it's not. Okay, that's a lot of stuff going on there. That makes this extraordinary. And in order to appreciate how extraordinary Mozart is, it's kind of nice to appreciate the ordinary, what it might have been, how simple this could have been, and we wouldn't be playing it today. And you know, we could talk about the metaphors. In fact, I think I will. The metaphors of this kind of thing, interruption, disruption, the subversion of it, that the unexpected is what it's all about. The idea that there are classical forms that are strict, which you read about and hear about everywhere, is a little bit misleading. There are aspects of the form that you must have in order to call it a name. To be a minuet, certain things have to happen. To be a sonata, certain things should happen. But those are very fundamental. And in order to make it a great sonata, or a piece by Mozart or Beethoven, as they did, you have to subvert what they did. It was subvert the form, full of surprises, because it's like, dare I say, life. Because if we were to tell you a story about somebody who got up and had breakfast and went to work and sat at a desk and then came home and went to bed, it's a great story, isn't it? But as soon as things go wrong, it could start with the weather. It could start with some kind of violent altercation. It could start with a kidnapping. As soon as things go wrong, you have a story. Conflict is what story is about. Sonata structure is storytelling. It's narrative storytelling. One of the things that makes a good performance is when the performers know, whether they talk about it or not, it makes no difference. But when they feel and know, this is surprising, this is new, this is unexpected, and you can tell, because of the way it's performed, that something unexpected has happened, something violent has happened. And if you were about to ask what's violent in music, I think you heard that already, the stabbing chords. Those are extreme, but they're obvious, which is why I use them. Now, getting back to Mozart's mind for a moment, he was not only, simultaneously not only dramatic, but always a little playful. It's a strange mix. And one of the things that makes it playful at the same time as dramatic are very detailed compositional things. So I'm going to point up a few of them, and I don't think they're complicated. For a composer, each note matters. And if you're in G minor, there's a note that is special because it's not part of the scale. It's called A flat. And it's used a lot for drama, because if you play a G minor scale, you have quite a few minor scales. Or because minor scales have some permutations. They're complex. But this A flat, A flats are not part of the key, but of course, all the chromatic notes get used. So the first interruption that the viola brings to us, and it's not always the viola that interrupts. It's just a way of not having to be with the group, I suppose. But, now we have had some passing A flats. Here's one. But because it's not part of the melody, it's not really getting your attention, and it's just passing by. It's very common for a note to pass by, like casing the joint, and then it comes back after it knows what it wants to do. So then, the A flat is our first detour. But it doesn't really accomplish anything, because we could end the piece, this phrase, in G minor. But that gets interrupted too. And then when this comes to an end, the A flat comes back, and it goes away here. And then it comes back, and then it goes away. So if you think this is extreme, fine. But if it makes sense to you, then it's important that the A flat comes in as the first interruption in one harmony. It comes back again to interrupt. And it comes back, it tries everything. It tries being forceful. It tries being forceful in a different way. And then it tries being cute. And that doesn't work either. Now, then comes the second theme. Now remember that A flat though, because if Mozart or Beethoven or Haydn, especially in this classical world, if they use a note in a way like that, a dramatic way, and you don't have to hear it as a note. I mean, I think a lot of musicians would hear the A flat. They wouldn't discuss it or say, did you hear what the A flat was doing? But we get it. You expect it to come back. And with a composer like Mozart, it not only comes back, it's brilliant how it comes back. In fact, you know what? Let's show that first before we forget about it, and then we'll go to the second theme. If you turn to, for the musicians, turn to the development, starting right there. What happens is the note A flat, I'll just describe this for a moment, comes back in every way that an A flat can come back harmonically. It's the root of the chord, now it's the third, then it's the fifth, and then it comes up on top, and then it comes up here. So the whole change at the beginning of the development, where things get crazy, is A flat fixated. And it's better because the A flat showed up earlier. It's almost like something like Sleeping Beauty, you know, where there's this, what is it, is it a witch? No, it's a fairy, the evil fairy. And the evil fairy was turned away, tried to change the key of the party and was told, no, it's staying in G minor. So it comes back disguised as the root of a chord and gets sent away. It comes back disguised as the third of a chord, the fifth of a chord, and then the seventh. See, that's what this is up here. It's the root, the third, the fifth, and when it comes up here, it's the seventh. And it wins because the key changes. Let's play that little section. You like that? Okay, try that. Yeah, okay, good. So it's hard to stop, isn't it? But it's fun for me. So now let's look at the so-called second theme. Normally, now catch the word normally, because if I say normally, it's probably not going to happen, right? Normally, the second theme, I have to put that in quotes too, is going to be in a relative key. If the piece starts in G minor like this, it will probably be in B flat major. But this second theme is not. Mozart teases us about which key we're going to be in when he does these, you know, things like this. But it ends up back here. And then the second theme stays in G minor. Let's hear the fake version of the second theme for a moment, the one that I wrote for you. Yeah, now if you know the real thing, that sounds very strange. But if you don't, it's fine. But what is that? That is a tune that is finished. By tune, I mean it's rounded off, it's done. There's a huge problem in America today with the word tune. It's not on the front pages, but everything's a tune or a song. If you go to iTunes, everything's a song, right? And sometimes it's very disturbing. Like you want to download a symphony and it says, buy song. And you say, no, I'm not buying a song. I'm buying a symphony. But anyway, a song ends, you know, and it's rounded with a sleep. No, that's Shakespeare. Okay. And so what happens here is I took the tune. This is what Mozart wrote. And that is already very telling because by repeating, there's a sense of struggle there because it's unusual to repeat a phrase like that. You might think something like that would be, if Mozart ever took a class in composition, which he never did, aside from his daddy very young, and you wrote that, probably the teacher would say, no, don't repeat yourself. Open it up. It's much nicer. But what happens is instead, by not opening it up, this makes you want to go, right? It's like, okay, like that. Da-dee-da-dum, ba-dee-da-dum, ba-da. It's more dramatic. Then, what in my fake version, I have to supply that with an answer. So I change key, which Mozart does later in the piece, but not here. And then I use the opening of the first theme to end it. But then it's over. Let's hear what the second theme really does. How open-ended, how unresolved, how elusive, how verbose it is. Okay, go ahead. Okay, good. Now, let's stop there. I mean, it goes on and on for a long time. I stopped there because we finally come to a cadence in B flat major, which it doesn't stop there. As you heard, it overlaps. But that's the first place you could say it's over, and it isn't even over. That's the first place that it rests for just a moment. That is not a tune. This is like developing variation, a phrase that is used to describe Schoenberg and Brahms, etc. But Mozart did this immediately, right from the get-go. That as you hear a tune for the first time, it unfolds, it has detours, it interrupts itself, and it interrupts itself in a way that reminds us of how people talk. At least my Aunt Nancy talks this way. Let's hear, could we play that again? And I just want you to think a little bit, I'll stop you much sooner, about how someone talks when you hear the melody. It's the exact same thing. Okay. All right. That was fun. I think mime is better than lecturing anyway. We should do an entire concert like this, or maybe not. But I couldn't think of another way to do this, but it's the most conversational stuff imaginable because it interrupts itself. Now, one of the things that I recommend as a study of art is to listen to a conversation that you're somewhat involved in with a few people and notice how far astray it goes. Don't get it back on track. How far astray does it go? And how quickly? And how many topics do you touch on? It's amazing. And then look at plays in the theater, because there are basically two big categories of plays. Those that capture that and those that don't. And the majority of them don't. Because if they did, nothing would happen. Because you'd never stay on a subject. A person who did capture that was Harold Pinter, which is why nothing happens. But they're great, because they're music. People start talking, it goes in another direction. You feel that it's scary or threatening or funny, but you're not sure why because you can't follow it exactly because they're never staying on a subject. They might come back to it, but by then, there are about 500 other subjects. There are lots of interviews with Harold Pinter, but his answers to me were all exactly what a composer would say in his interviews. And one of the things he said was when he started writing plays, he listened to the way people actually talk and tried to figure out how to use that. And there's some cartoons that he made years ago. I mean, he supplied the text for the cartoons. And because it's a cartoon, you expect to be able to understand what's going on. That's exactly like having a minuet. And you can't follow it because it's Mozart or Harold Pinter. And you're watching these two people talking, and they change topics so often or say almost nothing. And they seem to be engaged in a conversation. In a lecture, sticking to the topic is also a challenge, as you can see. But it's also a demonstration that I was hoping would make a point, which I forgot what it was. No. But I'm getting back to it now. Okay, so by the way, that theme started in G minor. It moved through various keys, and it finally cadences in B flat major because that's the key that you expected all along. Maybe you didn't know that, but subliminally you feel it, and that's the standard norm, as opposed to the unusual norm. You get there. But when you get to B flat, you feel comforted, and so he gives you a bit of a cadence. But being Mozart, he doesn't stop there. Now, let me ask them now, these wonderful players, to start in the same place. We're going to go all the way to the double bar. So you will hear what you've just heard, and you'll follow that this idea of the theme keeps going, and then new energy appears, and you get all the themes. You've heard the second theme, the first theme comes back, but all of it is in counterpoint. It's all simultaneous, which also can happen in a conversation at home. And then the energy increases, and then suddenly some amazing thing happens. I just want to point out that sometimes the melodic writing in Mozart, we think it's so beautiful, so melodic, of course it is. But if you tried to sing certain passages, you would have a difficult time, like this one. All right. I mean, do you want to play that on the violin, just the first violin? You want to sing that? I'm just mentioning it because it sounds fantastic in the context of the piece, and Mozart loves these extraordinary leaps. And there are leaps, not quite as extreme, but close in his operas for singers. Fiordiligi gets to do it in Così, and Queen of the Night gets not so much the leaps, but the heights. And there are leaps in many of his operas, and then people after him, like Rossini, also did this, with these enormous leaps. So there's very singable melodies. You think you should try it. Okay, so let's start at the second theme. Hear how it moves through all these dialogues and conversations, and then it gets new energy, and finally it will come to a kind of end. And I think that end should be right before the A-flat exposition. Right, beautiful, and that's exactly where this begins. Now, you just heard this little passage. And one of the things about this that's interesting compositionally, and it's very fundamental to composing in a key, is that we keep hearing, we're in B flat major, and we keep getting this G flat over the B flat down here. So we're getting a diminished chord, which is a little scary, but the B flat is holding us down like an anchor. You get the feeling that this note is trying to cause trouble. That's what it feels like. Bam, bam, but it keeps resolving down like this. But then you get this, essentially. The G flat has become an F sharp. Now, there's a lot of discussion about this sort of thing today. It's an identity thing. It's a G flat that considers itself an F sharp. It gets support from the harmony, and so it's able to change key. I hope you're all understanding my subtext. It's been going on for a long time. It's nothing new in art. So basically, what Mozart is giving us is called an enharmonic modulation, which is something, as I always say, you can throw that around at a cocktail party. It's really impressive. If you say, what I liked about the performance, after someone says that, that they thought the violist was handsome, you say, I liked the enharmonic modulation in the middle of the exposition. And they go. But basically, when this gets redefined as an F sharp, and then, that means we can go back, which it does. It actually repeats and goes back. But Mozart knows that he wants to go on the second time to this A flat thing. So he has to give us another solution. Now the F sharp's down here. So he just says, I better do this differently. That's why he does that twice. Now remember the minuet. You get these two shocking things ending on diminished chords. Later in the piece, just like in the minuet, he does this 3 times. Because if he does it twice, the surprise is over. If he does it 3 times, you have a fresh surprise and, again, the saturated chromatic scale, the complete use of all the tones. It's really amazing. Let's play when it happens 3 times. How about starting? Oh, look at that leap in the first violin. Same thing, really. Okay, how about right there? You guys read music, right? Okay. It's very effective. And then, now we're going to hear the little bit of a coda. There is a coda. Now we've skipped a lot of music, but we're trying to give you a sense of the whole thing here. In the coda, the second theme and the first theme, I mean, it starts with the first theme and a little counterpoint, but we get this kind of dripping chromaticism. It feels almost like paint sliding down a canvas. And what's great is several things. You get, it calms down, and what is that chord? It's A flat major. I'll point it out when they play it. In other words, there's a still moment, right, at the turning point of the coda, and it's an A flat major chord, which is that same A flat that caused all the trouble in the beginning and came in every disguise it could find. It comes back at a crucial moment, and then, well, we've had this tune going, reaching up, and at one point it goes, it goes all over the place. But it never goes down. But here it does. It goes. Right? It goes low. You want to play that for us? On the violin, just the violin for a moment. Oh. Isn't that great? Yeah, that only happens at the end. And that's a kind of symmetry, because it's always been up and up and up. And now it's balanced by this drop down, not in the bottom part, but in the pickup body. It's really incredible. Now, let me see, before we hear more of it. Yes, another crucial moment for listening. Before the return, now we have a phrase called the recapitulation, and these are the basic pillars of what's called sonata form. And as you know, sonata form, I always say this, it is so not a form. But it is, up to a certain extent. You like that? You have to come back to the key. So there's usually a pedal point. Could you play the cello part alone from 125? This is a really amazing cello solo. Beautiful. Okay, now that's a pedal. A pedal. Pedal point is an old term. It comes from an organ pedal. You can leave your foot on the pedal and all kinds of things happen around it. This is a great one. And you know, like everything in art of any kind, a great composer will take a very simple thing, a simple technique, an old technique, and breathe fresh air into it, new life. And here, that pedal is going on, and yes, the other instruments are trying to get to the key of G minor. But what's amazing is how dissonant and how aggressively he tries to do this. It kind of sounds like something disintegrating and falling apart. It's quite extraordinary. And in fact, at one spot, this is really the most unusual moment of that. The cello is keeping this D going, and we hear, that's a cadence. That's the most dissonant one. It's great. So let's hear that section from, let's back up just a little bit. Where would you like to back up to? Perhaps 121 or 122 or something like that? Okay, do that again.
Take up to 122.
Yeah, that's really, it's extraordinary. Another great thing where Mozart combines an old-fashioned simple technique or idea with something extraordinary is a chord progression where we hear an amazing circle of fifths. Now, the circle of fifths is one of the oldest chord progressions you can possibly find. Can we start at 112 or 13? Oh, no, let's say pick up to 111. We'll listen to this once. Okay, great. Now, that is it's a famous moment in the piece because it's so moving. It's so touching because of one note in each chord. And that note comes from here. Now, chords are built in thirds. So we have 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. This ninth, a minor ninth, is a dissonant and heart-wrenching note in this kind of music. So he takes the most ordinary, most common, but still important, fundamental chord progression that is used over and over in the classical period and after and before. It actually stems from the Baroque and moves all the way into the Romantic period, which is the circle of fifths. So if I take out the beautiful note, we have this. Circle of fifths. Violins and cellos and violas are tuned in fifths. Fifths are very basic to tonality. It's how the key signatures move. Sharps go up in fifths, flats go down in fifths. Fifths are fundamental. So, but what Mozart does is he keeps the minor ninth moving. That dissonant note, because it is also motivic, ba-dam, we hear the theme, we hear the pain, and underneath it is this reassuring circle of fifths. That combination of a familiar old chord progression with this dissonant interval that we've heard where it comes from, we understand how it got there, makes this really extraordinary music. Now, let me just see how we're doing. Oh, you probably should play it. But I think what we might do is not only play the whole thing, but how would you be about also playing the minuet? Yes? So let's go back. We're going to hear the complete minuet, but let's not do any repeats because we'll never get through it. Playing a minuet without repeats is very difficult for musicians because you never do that ever in a concert, ever. So if we have a train wreck, it's because somebody's trying to be good. So we'll do the minuet and trio. And aside from the stabbing chords, which may or not be running a sword through the heart or death, or his father dying, or rage at the aristocracy, all of these things. And we know that it's a disruption of form that's essential. Bear in mind also how polite the trio is. It's almost as if Mozart is saying, yes, I know that in society, the emotions that you're going to hear in this piece are not acceptable, at least not for a composer. They're okay if you're a baron. They're not acceptable. But in music, fine. So let's hear the minuet and then the first movement.
Thank you.